Roald Dahl, the Twits, Part 2. Mrs. Twit has the strings. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, "There you are! You're sitting in your old chair, and you shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground." Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet, and by the golly, the man was right. Her feet was not touching the ground. Mr. Twit, of course, had been just as clever as the chair as he'd been in the working. Every night, when he had gone downstairs and stuck a little bit extra on the stick, he had done the same at the board legs on Mrs. Twit's hair. "Just look at you sitting there in your same old chair," he cried, "and you shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs. Twit went white with fear. "You got the shrinked!" cried Mr. Twit, pointing his fingers at her like a pistol. "You've got them badly. You got the most terrible case of shrinks I ever seen." Mrs. Twit became so frightened she began to dribble. But Mr. Twit, still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for her at all. "I suppose you know what happens to you when you get the strings," he said. "What?" gasped Mrs. Twit. "What happens?" "Your head shrinks into your neck, and your neck shrinks into your body, and your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrink into your feet. And in the end, there's nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes." "I can't bear it!" cried Mrs. Twit. "It's a terrible disease," said Mr. Twit, "the worst in the world." "How long have I got?" cried Mrs. Twit. "How long before I finish up a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes?" Mr. Twit put a very solemn face. "At the rate you're going," he said, shaking his head steadily, "I'd say not more than 10 or 11 days. "But isn't there anything we can do?" cried Mrs. Twit. "There's only one cure for the shrinks," said Mr. Twit. "Tell me!" she cried. "Oh, tell me quickly!" "We'll have to hurry," said Mr. Twit. "I'm ready, I'm hurry, I do everything you say," cried Mrs. Twit. "You won't last long if you don't," said Mr. Twit, giving her another grisly grin. "What is it I must do?" cried Mrs. Twit, closing her cheeks. "You've got to be stretched," said Mr. Twit. Mrs. Twit got to stretching. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoor when he had everything ready for the great stretching. He had 100 balloons and lots of string. He had a gas cylinder for filling the balloons. He had fixed an iron ring on the ground. "Stand here," he said, pointing to the iron ring. He then tied Mrs. Twit's ankle to the iron ring. When that was done, he began to building the balloon with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it was filled with gas, it pulled on a string, trying to go up and up. Mr. Twit tied the end of the strings to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Some he tied around her neck, some under her arms, some to her wrist, and some even to her hair. Soon there were 50 colored balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head. "Can you feel them stretching you?" asked Mr. Twit. I can," cried Mrs. Twit. "They're stretching me like mad." He put another 10 balloons. The upward pull became very strong. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now, with her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upward by the balloons. She was unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that was a couple of days and night to teach her a lesson. In fact, he was just about to leap when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something silly. "Are you sure my feet were tied properly to the ground?" she gasped. "If the strings around my ankle break, it will be goodbye for me." And that's what gave Mr. Twit his second nasty idea. Mrs. Twit go ballooning up. "There's enough to pull here to take me to the moon," Mrs. Twit cried out. "To take you to the moon?" exclaimed Mr. Twit. "What's a ghastly thought." "We wouldn't want anything like that to happen. Oh dear me, no." "We most certainly wouldn't," cried Mrs. Twit. "Put some more strings around my ankle quickly. I want to be absolutely safe." "Very well, my angel," said Mr. Twit, and with a girlish grin on his lips, he knelt down at her feet. He took a knife from his pocket, and with one quick slash, he cut through the strings holding Mrs. Twit's ankle to the iron ring. She went up like a rocket. "Help!" she screamed. "Save me!" But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds, she was high up in the blue sky and climbing fast. Mr. Twit stood below looking up. "What a pretty sight," he said to himself. "What lovely all those balloons look in the sky. And what a marvelous bit of luck for me. At least the old hag is lost and gone forever." Mrs. Twit came ballooning down. Mrs. Twit may have been ugly and she may have been beastly, but she was not stupid. High up there in the sky, she had a bright idea. "If I can get rid of some of these balloons," she said to herself, "I will stop going up and start to come down." She began biting through the strings that held the balloons to her wrist and arms and the neck and her hair. Each time she bit through a string and let the balloon float away, the upper pull got less and her rate of climb slowed down. When she had bitten through 20 strings, she stopped going up altogether. She stayed still in the air. She bit through one more string. Very, very slowly, she began to blow downwards. It was a calm day. There was no wind at all, and because of this, Mrs. Twit had gone absolutely straight up. She now became absolutely straight down. As she floated gently down, Mrs. Twit's petticoat blew like a parachute, blowing her long knickers. It was a grand sight, a glorious day, and thousands of birds came flying in from miles around to stare at the extraordinary old woman in the sky. Mr. Twit gasped a horrid shock. Mr. Twit, who thought he had seen his ugly white bird the last time, was sitting in the garden celebrating with a mug of beer. Silently, Mrs. Twit came floating down. When she was about to hit the house upon Mr. Twit, she suddenly called at the top of her voice, "Here I come, you grisly old granny, you rotten old turnip, you bilky old trumpet!" Mr. Twit jumped as though he had been stung by a giant wasp. He dropped his beer. He looked up. He gasped, he gurgled. A few choking sounds came out of his mouth. "Arr!" he said. "Ouch! I will get you for this!" shouted Mrs. Twit. She was floating down right on top of him. She was purple with rage and slashing the air with her long working stick, which she had somehow managed to hang on to all the time. "I'll swish you into a swazzle," she shouted. "I'll swish you into a swizzle. I gnash you into a gnozzle. I nush you into a nazzle." And before Mr. Twit had time to run away, this bundle of balloons and petticoats and berry landed right on top of him, slashing lashing out with the stick and cracking him all over his body. The house, the tree, and the monkey cage. But that's enough of that. We can't go on forever watching these two disgusting people doing disgusting things to each other. We must get ahead with the story. Here is a garden of Mr. and Mrs. Twit's house and garden. Same house, some house. It looks like a prison. And not a window anywhere. Who wants windows? Mr. Twit has said when they had building it, who was every time Dick and Harry peeping in to see what you're doing. It didn't occur to Mr. Twit that windows are meant mainly for looking out, not for looking into. And what do you think about the ghastly garden? Mrs. Twist was a gardener. She was very good at growing thistles and stinging nettles. I always grew plenty of spiky thistles and plenty of stinging nettles, she used to say. They keep us out of nasty, nosy little children. Near the house you can see Mr. Twist's work shed. To one side, there was a big, dead tree. It never had leaves. Only because it was sad. And not far from the tree, you can see the monkey cage. There are 4 monkeys in it. They belong to Mr. Twit. You will hear about them later. Hog-tied sticky glue. Once a week on Wednesdays, the Twits and bird pie for dinner. Mr. Twit cut the birds and Mrs. Twit cooked them. Mr. Twit was good at catching birds. On the day before bird pie day, he would put the ladder up against a big dead tree and climb into the branches with a bucket of glue and a paintbrush. The glue he used was something called Hog-tight and was stickier than any other glue in the world. He would paint it along with the top of the branches and then go away. As the sun went down, birds would fly in from all around the roost for the night in the big dead tree. They didn't know, poor things, that the branches were smeared with horrible Hog-tight. The moment they landed on the branch, their beak stuck, and that was that. The next morning, it was the bird pie day. Mr. Twit would climb up the ladder again and grab all the wrench birds that were stuck to the tree. It didn't matter what kind they were. Some thrushes, blackbirds, sparrows, crows, little zany wrens, robins, anything. They all went into the pot for Wednesday's bird pie dinner. 4 sticky little boys. On one Tuesday evening, after Mr. Twit had bent the ladder and smelled the tree with the Hog-tight, 4 little boys crept into the garden to look at the monkeys. They didn't care about the thistles and stinging nettles, not when they were monkeys to look at. After a while, they got tired of looking at the monkeys, so they explored a boulder into the garden and found the ladder leaning against a big dead tree. They decided to climb up. It's just for fun. There's nothing wrong with that. The next morning, when Mr. Twit went out to collect the birds, he found a poor, miserable little boy sitting in the tree, stuck as tight as could be by the seats of their pants to the branches. There was no birds because the brilliance of boys had scared them away. The next morning, Mr. Twit was furious. As there was no bird for my pie tonight, he shouted. Then it'll have to be boys. Boys instead. He started climbing the ladder. Boy's pie must be better than bird pie, he went on, grinning horribly. More meat. And not so many tiny little bones. The boys were frightened. He's going to boil us, cried one of them. He'll stew us alive, wailed the second one. He'll cook us with carrots, cried the third. But the bird little boy, who had more sense than others, whispered, Listen, I just had an idea. We're only stuck by a seat of pants. So quick, unbutton your pants, and slid out of them and bowed to the ground. Mr. Twit had reached the top of the ladder and was about to just make a grab at the nearest boy when they suddenly tumbled out of the tree and ran for home, with their naked bottoms winking at the sun. Now for the monkeys. The four monkeys in the case in the garden were one family. They were Mugwump and his wife and their two small children. And what on earth were Mr. and Mrs. Twit doing with monkeys in their garden? Well, in the old days, they had both worked in the circus as monkey trainers. They used to teach monkeys to do tricks and to dress up in human clothes and smoke pipes and all the rest of the nonsense. Today, although they are very retired, Mr. Twit still wanted to train monkeys. It was his dreams that one day he would own the first great upside-down monkey circus in the world. That meant that the monkeys had to do everything upside down. They had to dance upside down on their hands with their feet in the air. They had to play football upside down. They had to balance one on the top of the other was upside down, with Mugwump at the bottom and the smallest baby Bunky at the very top. They even had to eat and drink upside down, and that is not an easy thing to do because the food and water has to go up your throat instead to down it. In fact, it is almost impossible what the monkeys simply had to do with, otherwise they got nothing. All this sounds pretty silly to you and me. It sounds pretty silly to the monkeys too. They absolutely hated having to do this upside down nonsense day after day. It made him giddy standing on their heads and the hours on end. Sometimes the two small monkey children would faint with much blood going in their heads, but Mr. Twit didn't care about that. He kept them practicing 6 hours every day, and if they didn't do as they were told, Mrs. Twit would soon come running with beastly stick. The roly-poly bird to the rescue. Mugwump and his family longed to escape from the case in Mr. Twit's garden and go back to African jungle where they have come from. They hated Mr. and Mrs. Twit for making their lives so miserable. They also hated them for what they had been doing, birds every Tuesday and Wednesday. Fly away, birds, they used to shout, jumping about in the case and waving their arms. Don't sit on the big dead tree. It's just been smeared all over with sticky glue. Go and sit somewhere else. But these were English birds and they couldn't understand the weird African language the monkeys spoke. So they took no notice and went on using the big dead tree and getting caught for Mrs. Twit bird pie. Then one day a truly magnificent bird blew down out of the sky and landed on the monkeys together. It's the roly-poly bird. What on earth are you doing down in England, roly-poly bird? Like the monkeys, the roly-poly bird came from Africa and he spoke the same language as they did. I come for a holiday, said roly-poly bird. I like to travel. He fluffed his marvelous colored feathers and looked down rather grandly at the monkeys. For most people, he went on, flying away on holiday is very expensive. But I can fly anywhere in the world for nothing. Do you know how to talk in these English birds? Mugwump asked him. Of course I do, said the roly-poly bird. It's no good going in the country without not knowing the language. Then we must hurry, said Mugwump. Today is Tuesday, and over there you can already see the revolting Mr. Twit of the leather painting sticky glue on all the branches of the big dead tree. This evening, when the birds came to the roost, you must warn them not to perch on the tree, or they will make into bird pie. That evening the roly-poly bird flew round and round the big that tree, singing out, "There's sticky stuff all over the tree. If you land on the branches, you never get free. So fly away, stay up high, or you finish up tomorrow in a hot bird pie."